This is Bygone Jacks, our unsung history from WJCT Public Media. September 20th, 1565. It's a dark and rainy dawn at La Caroline, a fortified French settlement on the south bank of the St. Johns River near what's now Jacksonville, Florida. Most of the French forces have sailed down the coast with Captain Jean Ribault to attack the Spanish fleet at St. Augustine. Of the 150 who remain at the fort, perhaps only 15 or 20 are able-bodied enough to stand guard. Among them is Jacques LeMoyne, the expedition's artist and cartographer.
Still recovering from months on starvation rations and a leg injury incurred in a battle with the Timucua, LeMoyne is probably relieved when, after more than a week's worth of wet and miserable nights on watch, Officer of the Guard Monsieur de la Vigne takes pity on the men and sends them off to rest.
After all, what are the chances the Spanish would attack in such a storm? And if they did, surely they'd come from the river where the fort's defenses were strongest. These miscalculations will cost the French dearly.
Guided by a French turncoat and allowed to pass without warning by local indigenous people whom the French had antagonized, Spanish soldiers led by Pedro Menendez approached the fort from the forest. Their sudden early morning attack catches the sleeping French, including Jacques LeMoyne, completely off guard.
On coming in for my watch, I laid down my arquebus, and, all wet through as I was, I threw myself into a hammock which I had slung up after the Brazilian fashion, hoping to get a little sleep. But on hearing the outcries, the noise of weapons, and the sound of blows, I jumped up again and was going out of the house to see what was the matter, when I met in the very doorway 2 Spaniards with their swords drawn, who passed on into the house without accosting me, although I brushed against them. When, however, I saw that nothing was visible except slaughter, and that the place of arms itself was held by the Spaniards, I turned back at once and made for one of the embrasures where I knew I could get out. I leaped down into the ditch, crossed it, and went on alone for some distance over rising ground into a piece of woods, until having reached the higher part of the hill, it was as if God gave me back my consciousness. For it is certain that the things that had happened since my leaving the house were as though I had been out of my wits.
Now on the run for his life, LeMoyne, exhausted and aching, has a single advantage over the Spanish conquistadors. He knows the local terrain. He uses this knowledge gained over the past 15 months spent exploring, painting, and mapping the area to get away from the fort.
His plan is to strike through the woods toward the seashore in search of the French ships he hopes are still moored at the mouth of the river. As he encounters other survivors of the massacre, he tries to convince them to join him.
A tailor named Grand Chemin agrees to the plan, but he decides to turn back after the two spend a day fighting through marsh grass and a night wading through waist-high waters. Declaring it would be better to let the Spanish kill them than remain any longer in such miserable conditions, Grand Chemin returns to the fort to surrender and is immediately killed.
Horrified, LeMoyne flees once again into the woods. Eventually, he manages to connect with a group of about 15 other refugees, including the fort's commander, René Ladinière, all of whom agreed to make their way toward the sea.
I will say nothing more except that we traveled in water more than waist deep for 2 days and 2 nights through swamps and reeds.
When the waterlogged group finally make their way to the coast, they're pulled to safety by the crew of the Lévrier, one of the 3 ships that remained along the St. Johns, rather than following Jean Ribault's doomed expedition against the Spanish. On September 25th, 5 days after the attack on La Caroline, Jacques LeMoyne and the rest of the handful of French survivors set sail for home.
When he died 20 years later, LeMoyne's widow would supposedly sell both the story of her husband's time in Florida and his surviving watercolors to a man named Theodore de Bry. De Bry used them to create a book so influential that it still shapes the way we picture Florida's indigenous population.
I'm Brendan Rivers.
I'm Tammy Cherry.
And you're listening to Bygone Jacks, our unsung history from WJCT Public Media.
In this episode, we tackle another misconception about the indigenous history of Jacksonville.
This is the story of how a 16th century publishing sensation has distorted our view of the Timucua to this day, and how it all may be based on a lie.
And a few quick notes before we get started. In this and the following episode, we'll be talking generally about the Timucua, indigenous people who lived in what's now South Georgia and North Florida, as well as more specifically about the Mocama, Timucua speakers who lived in the area around modern-day Jacksonville.
Keep in mind that these indigenous people never actually called themselves Timucua. That name was first used by Europeans and has been adopted by scholars to describe the various peoples who spoke the Timucua language. Similarly, Mocama is a dialect of Timucua, not a self-identification. And for historical context, we will be sharing quotes from primary sources, and some of those sources may have used racist or derogatory language.
If you have a mental image of the Timucua, chances are that image was made by an artist named Theodore de Bry.
De Bry was born in the 1520s in what's now Belgium, where he trained as a goldsmith, like his father. He left his hometown of Liège around 1559, possibly for religious reasons, or maybe just to try to find somewhere with fewer goldsmiths and more work. About a decade later, de Bry found himself emigrating from Antwerp to England. Probably a smart move for a Protestant, because not long afterwards, Spanish Catholic troops captured the city.
In 1585, he took his family and moved to London. I think he thought he could probably make money there.
That's Gerald Milanish, curator emeritus at the Florida Museum of Natural History at the University of Florida.
And he engraved maps for atlases. He engraved portraits of famous personages in London, and became quite well known. And while he was in London, he met up with Richard Hakluyt.
Richard Hakluyt was an Anglican priest who became fascinated with geography and exploration at a young age. And though he wasn't an official member of the English government, Hakluyt worked closely with top advisors to Queen Elizabeth I to promote colonization.
It was while serving the English ambassador in France that he first got his hands on a copy of René de Laudonnière's account of his time at Fort Caroline, which at the time would have been known as La Caroline. Hakluyt would publish Laudonnière's account in 1587 as part of a larger series of exploration narratives. The book was titled A Notable History, containing 4 voyages made by certain French captains into Florida. Pithy, right? Its introduction suggests Hakluyt's knowledge of Fort Caroline didn't just come from Laudonnière.
Many special points concerning the commodities of these parts, the accidents of the Frenchmen's government therein, the causes of their good or bad success, with the occasions of the abandoning of one of their forts and the surprise of the other by the enemy, are herein truly and faithfully recorded. The same with diverse other things, of chiefest importance, are lively drawn in colors at no small charges by the skillful painter James Morgs, sometime living in the Blackfriars in London, which was an eyewitness of the goodness and fertility of those regions, and hath put down in writing many singularities which are not mentioned in this treatise.
James Morgs is an anglicized version of the name Jacques LeMoyne. By 1587, the painter had been living for at least 6 years in Blackfriars, a cosmopolitan district of London that would soon become home to a young playwright named William Shakespeare.
LeMoyne, who now had a wife and child, was still working as an artist and had published a book of flower paintings and a volume of natural history woodcuts. He'd also joined an unofficial think tank on New World exploration, headed up by Sir Walter Raleigh, to whom Richard Hakluyt dedicated his notable history.
So, here they are, all in London in the late 1580s. A French artist with a tale to tell, an English writer with an interest in travel narratives, and a Flemish goldsmith who recently learned how to create high-quality illustrations using the relatively new process of copper engraving.
Hakluyt, whose main goal is to interest the English in what would become America to help drive settlement there, senses an opportunity.
And when, I guess, it became known to him that Theodore de Bry was such a well-known and capable engraver, he began to talk with him, and they seemed to have worked out a deal that Hakluyt and his backers would support the Bry's publication of books that contained not only narratives, nearly all of which Hakluyt had already published, but he would provide engravings to help sell the books and bring the Americas and its people to his readers. In other words, pictures sell books.
Though Hakluyt and de Bry may have initially discussed a book about the French experiences in Florida, Hakluyt's pro-colonization agenda meant that they needed to start with something a little more likely to tempt Englishmen to cross the Atlantic. So when Theodore de Bry and his sons published their first book in 1590, it was a new edition of Thomas Harriot's narrative of England's attempt to colonize what's now eastern North Carolina.
The text was accompanied by 23 engraved images, 16 of which featured the local Algonquins and highlighted, and sometimes deliberately exaggerated, what to a European audience seemed their strange customs. And that audience was fascinated.
The book, which appeared in English, French, German, and Latin editions, became immensely popular. Riding that wave of success, the de Bry family, now operating out of Frankfurt, went on to produce 27 volumes about the Americas, Africa, and Asia over the next 4 decades, each including deliberately dramatic engravings depicting exotic locations and their native peoples, and accompanied by European travel narratives.
By the time the second of the de Bry's volumes on the Americas appeared in 1591, the publisher had fallen out with Hakluyt, and LeMoyne was dead. The book, called A Brief Narration of Those Things Which Befell the French in the Province of Florida in America, focused largely on the French settlement attempt at Fort Caroline. It reprinted Laudonniere's narrative, plus a never-before-published account by Jacques LeMoyne, along with 42 engravings based on the artist's work, many featuring indigenous Timucua speakers. The introduction of the book offered an explanation for the source of these editions, a sort of deathbed confession.
Jacques LeMoyne, also known as Morgues, a Frenchman and distinguished painter, as one of those 15 who escaped with Laudonniere from the slaughter, witnessed and participated in the entire action. On his return, he related the events in sequence to the King of France, by whom he was urged to put them down on paper. He undertook this most faithfully in his own tongue, but he kept it private to himself and his friends, and thus far was unwilling to publish it. But a few years afterward, when the good Theodore de Bry of Liege, a citizen of Frankfurt, was visiting London in England, he formed a deep friendship with Morgues, and at the time gathered information on a great many questions to do with this story, so that the publication of these matters was agreed between them. Then, on Morgues' death, the aforesaid Theodore bought the narrative for himself from his widow.
But is that actually how it happened? Or did a family of publishers, none of whom ever traveled outside Europe, fabricate our image of Northeast Florida and its early inhabitants in the hopes of selling more books? We'll try to answer that question after the break.
Join the most essential conversation in Northeast Florida and Southeast Georgia. Every day on First Coast Connect, hear from the biggest newsmakers and changemakers in the region. We also want your phone calls, emails, and tweets. Engagement is what drives this program. I'm Ann Schindler. Join us weekdays at 9 a.m. on WJCT News 89.9.
Hi, join me, Dr. Joe Servin, for What's Health Got to Do with It, a weekly program that examines where and how healthcare intersects with your daily life. I'll speak with local and national healthcare leaders to help you navigate your most pressing medical issues. Email health@wjct.org to join the conversation, and tune in Saturdays at 4 p.m. and Sundays at 9 p.m. on WJCT News 89.9.
Welcome back. De Bry's Florida book was popular throughout Europe and could be found in the libraries of luminaries ranging from artist Peter Paul Rubens to philosopher John Locke. In the 17th and 18th centuries, its images were reproduced in other works and sold as individual plates, some of which were colorized.
The engravings regained popularity in 1946 when they were reproduced in the New World, published by Hungarian-American author and journalist Stefan Laurent.
Since then, many archaeologists have used the Laurent and de Bry works to inform their own research. The engravings have been used in countless books and museum exhibits. Even the Timucua village depicted in a mural in the U.S. Capitol's westward expansion corridor clearly draws its inspiration from de Bry's engravings.
But in recent years, as archaeologists and historians have discovered more and more discrepancies between the illustrations and what's known about Florida's 16th century indigenous population, some prominent scholars have started to question the authenticity of the images made famous by de Bry.
His intention was not to create a series of realistic photographs. He was not trying to tell us exactly what these indigenous communities looked like. He was trying to advertise, in fact, Protestant colonization efforts, and he was also trying to entertain his audience. So the best way to think about the engravings that he made are as cartoons or caricatures, that they reflect more about what de Bry thought his audience wanted than about what was actually being seen by the original artists.
That's Denise Boussy, a history professor at the University of North Florida. She teaches courses on local indigenous history and the Native South.
One major concern shared by Boussy and other scholars is the fact that no one has ever seen a verifiably authentic original of any of LeMoyne's Florida images. Accounts of LeMoyne's escape from the sack of Fort Caroline don't mention if he was able to save any of his work.
I mean, I just find it hard to believe that LeMoyne is in Fort Caroline, is under attack by the Spanish in the middle of the night, so he's going to grab all of his artwork in the pouring down rain, walk in chest-high water all the way out to a boat and have him there. So at best, he's going to do this 3-4 months later from memory.
That's archaeologist Keith Ashley, who teaches anthropology at the University of North Florida.
After Fort Caroline was taken, the Spanish chaplain, Father Lopez de Mendoza Grajales, wrote about what Pedro Menendez and his men found there, including a great many books and 1,000 bad things belonging to a Lutheran who was a great map maker and necromancer.
We can't know for sure that he was referring to LeMoyne here, but there's no record of another French cartographer on the expedition. And it's possible that the Spanish, who would already consider the Protestant LeMoyne a heretic, might label as a necromancer the artist who illustrated what they thought of as the dark magic of indigenous religious practices. It's also possible that those books, which Menendez ordered burned, included maps and sketches of indigenous people and their traditions.
LeMoyne was an artist, and he painted literally hundreds of scenes of butterflies and insects and plants and an occasional animal. Many of those paintings exist today in libraries in London, like the Tate, also here in New York, where I am today, at the Morgan Library and other places. I've looked at hundreds of them. There's not a single one that shows any plant or animal or scene from the Americas.
Melanish believes that LeMoyne never actually painted any indigenous people while he was in Florida. Rather, he may have told de Bry about the region's indigenous population when they met in London, or in written notes or an account that de Bry got after LeMoyne's death.
But if de Bry didn't actually have any of LeMoyne's original paintings or sketches, where did the now famous images come from?
When you start looking at all these engravings in all 27 of these volumes, many of them have obviously just been made up. They came from the debris shot from the people that worked for him or out of their minds. They would read something and say, well, what does that look like? So the engravings of Florida show, for instance, mountains in the background. As everyone knows, we don't have mountains.
Keep in mind that the de Brys weren't scholars. They were publishers trying to sell books. In fact, scholars who did work with the de Brys complained about their somewhat lax approach to detail.
After de Bry published his manuscript on Roman inscriptions, antiquarian Jean-Jacques Boissard wrote to a friend decrying the de Brys' lack of knowledge on the topic and exaggerated use of engravings. He even scorned the family's focus on making money.
And according to Dutch historian Michael van Grossen, the practice of embellishing images may have been pretty common for the de Brys. Van Grossen estimates that nearly half of the 600 or so engravings in the 27 de Bry volumes were made up, including 22 of the 42 Florida engravings, and that many of the other engravings were significantly altered.
In other words, when the de Brys lacked original material to work from, they might have borrowed details or even full scenes from other sources to create images based on the accompanying narratives. Even when original drawings were available, the de Brys would sometimes tweak them to make them more dramatic or salacious. For instance, by removing the clothes of indigenous people or by exaggerating the size of exotic wildlife. Which is why you might have seen an image of 6 Timucua fighting an alligator that's bigger than all of them put together.
This tendency of the de Brys to play fast and loose with their illustrations didn't go entirely unnoticed by readers. Even Thomas Jefferson, who at one time owned the only collection of de Bry's work in America, said in an 1812 letter to John Adams that in de Bry's depictions of indigenous people, quote, fact and fable are mingled together without regard to any favorite system.
This could explain the issues with the book's depictions of the Timucua in the Jacksonville area, why palisades are drawn around villages when archaeologists have found no evidence that the Timucua built such walls, or why nautilus shells, which are only found in the Pacific, are featured prominently in Timucua religious ceremonies. Again, history professor Denise Boussy.
There are a lot of different problems. So the way that the villages are laid out is wrong. The way they're growing agriculture is wrong. The way they're conducting war is wrong. Their depictions of indigenous people, especially men, are often efforts to really undermine their authority. Depictions of indigenous women are often salacious. There's just so much that's wrong. And we really have to mistrust all of it until we can demonstrate that any of it is accurate.
The narrative attributed to LeMoyne, including the dramatic tale LeMoyne tells of his escape from the sack of Fort Caroline from the beginning of this episode, has also been questioned, and not just because it, like other colonialist narratives, tends to downplay the role of local indigenous people.
The artist's original manuscript, which would have been written in French, is said to have vanished after LeMoyne's widow sold it to de Bry. So we have no way of knowing what, if anything, de Bry actually got from her. It's worth noting that of the 49 total accounts included in de Bry's series, only LeMoyne's never appeared in print elsewhere.
And even if de Bry did actually get a narrative written by LeMoyne, readers only would have been exposed to it through Latin and German translations done by other people.
Melanish believes de Bry or Hakluyt wrote the narrative, piecing it together using Laudonnière's and other French accounts of Fort Caroline, or from conversations one or both of them may have had with the artist. If any information in the book did come from LeMoyne, Melanish says it probably wasn't much.
So we have plenty of evidence suggesting that the LeMoyne narrative and the images attributed to him and made famous by de Bry are questionable, and that the images, at least, are riddled with inaccuracies. Yet they still continue to shape how the public thinks about the Timucua and early Florida, more than 400 years after their publication.
Images for us, too, are really gripping. To read something flatly in an article or on a museum exhibit display is very different than to visibly see it, right? We experience that visual so differently. So I don't say we can't use them at all, because that would be throwing out an important series of primary sources, but I say we have to use them to understand what Europeans were projecting, their mental world, what this tells us about their expectations, and what they're trying to achieve through these images. But we can't use it to talk about indigenous people themselves.
And it's this limited, inaccurate view which has crystallized how we think about Northeast Florida's indigenous history today. A view that flattens 13,000 years of indigenous occupation into just a handful of images from a 10-year window in the 16th century. So, in more recent times, some artists have been working to create alternatives to the de Bry images.
Yeah, so there are actually some really great late 20th, early 21st century efforts by artists. NPS at one point sponsored, I think, a competition where artists produced more accurate images of Mocamas.
There's also Theodore Morris, an artist who has spent decades working with archaeologists, historians, and anthropologists to make his paintings of Florida's indigenous people, including the local Mocama, as realistic as possible, down to researching patterns from pottery to incorporate into the body art of the people he paints. Morris has contributed to nearly 30 exhibits around the state, mostly at history museums, and happily provides his images free of charge to museums.
But still, when you Google the Timucua, there he is, Theodore de Bry, right there in the public domain, so much easier to find and free to use.
What I'd really like to do is teach a class at UNF where we, with students, critically read the de Brys, decide on a group that we'd like to redo, and hire indigenous artists to redo them, and then offer those to the world copyright free. So this is just the beginnings of a dream, but if anyone out there has a lot of money and is very interested, or if board members from UNF are listening, please read our application.
This year, Bussy, Ashley, and the students at the University of North Florida launched a website called Indigenous Florida, which offers a virtual tour of the Fort Caroline Monument, centering the perspective of the local Mocama.
Included on the site are multiple public domain images which can be downloaded and which offer a less distorted look at how local indigenous people might have appeared. Not a de Bry in sight. But even Milanish, the emeritus curator at the Florida Natural History Museum, admits it can be hard to let go.
And it's kind of depressing. The first time I ever gave a talk about this, I was in Tallahassee, Florida, and people said, "Oh my God, how depressing. We love those drawings. We've all used them. We used them to get information, and we've taught classes and everything else."
And here's archaeologist Keith Ashley again.
As we find more information, that new information can really bolster and strengthen and reinforce what we've been saying. It can just refine it, tweak it, maybe give it more nuances, or at times it can say, you know what, you were wrong about this thing, or there's some minor thing that shows up. We don't think it's important, but then we start to see this minor piece of evidence showing up more and more and more as we do more work. Then we say, you know what, this is not something that needs to be swept under the rug, so we need to bring these things out. And I think sometimes people are resistant to change, like, oh, we're trying to rewrite history. We're just trying to present the evidence that's out there in a more updated fashion that includes multiple lines of evidence.
Archaeology, which informs much of our understanding of indigenous history, is a science. And like all sciences, when new evidence comes to light, the consensus shifts to account for it.
That's how science works, that once we have these interpretations, if we challenge them, we can change them, for the better. And so I think that's one difference between sometimes when we write for scholarly articles, all of ours go through peer review, and that's a really important thing. Anything can be thrown out there on the internet.
Or into a 16th century engraving.
Next time on Bygone Jacks.
Juan Alonzo Cabal's my name, Florida's native son, sent to die in some Cuban land. I'm the last Timucuan.
We'll learn about a man named Juan Alonzo Cabale and how even a true story can lead to a false narrative.
This is Bygone Jacks, our unsung history from WJCT Public Media. Thanks for listening. I'm Brendan Rivers.
And I'm Tammy Cherry.
A big thanks to Jennifer Gray and her colleagues at Florida State College at Jacksonville, whose research made this podcast possible.
If you're interested in learning more about the River City's past, check out FSCJ's History of Jacksonville course.
If you'd like to learn more about local indigenous history, take a look at the show notes at wjct.org/bygonejacks, where you can find links to the sources we used and more.
And if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a rating and review. Thanks for listening.